Well, from the letter to the Thessalonians, I'll quote, "Anyone unwilling to work should not eat, for we hear that some of you are living in idleness, mere busybodies, and not doing any work." I have a story which is humbling, which is a new family started coming to Messiah Rhinebeck, and when they got home, one of the little boys, he was 7 or 8 years old, said to the mother, "Mom, what's Father Richard's real job?" Idleness and busybodies. What I want to think about today is change and how change is inextricably part of our experience of life and of faith. Now, I know I'm addressing a group of Episcopalians, so let me just say I know that there is change and change. So I brought with me a picture, which I'll read, now you'll be able to see it, that I shared with Aaron earlier, which came from Facebook. And it simply says, "Dozens hospitalized after new hymn is introduced in church." We like to think that there's a permanence to our lives. There's a stability, a predictability, a known factor in all that we do. But the reality of life and the reality of our faith is that change is part of it always. And not just change, but change that doesn't come all in one go, but is mixed. It contains various elements of various things, past and present, the hopes and our fears, but also perhaps light and darkness. And I want to think about darkness a little bit in today's sermon because it's a very dark prophecy in Luke's gospel for the Jewish people. Now, in terms of just a little bit of Bible study, there's controversy in this passage of Luke as to whether Jesus actually said it at the time in his lifetime, or was it edited later and added because the context of the followers of Jesus and the Jewish people had so radically changed. So in other words, was it redacted back in to the text or is it original text? And there's a great debate among Bible scholars as to which it is. Indications would seem that indeed it may be a redaction. And the event that is described in Luke's gospel is a historic one, and that is the destruction of the great temple in Jerusalem. Now, this meant a seismic change in the way the Jews practiced their faith and the very foundation of their faith. They believed that the temple was the embodiment of God in their midst. It was not just a beautiful building, extraordinary in its size and its decoration, but it actually embodied God in a significant way. And when the Romans destroy the temple in 70 of the Common Era, all bets are off in terms of the Jewish people, because the center of their faith has been taken away. And they need to rethink and reinvent and rediscover, perhaps, the basis of their faith without having the temple. And they turn to a personal relationship with God that's not based in a building. They turn and live their lives of faith as community, but not centered on liturgical worship in the temple. And in that, they laid the work for what we understand as Christians is a deeply personal relationship with God. We love our churches deeply, but we don't feel that they contain God. Instead, they point us to God. So given that incredibly traumatic moment for the Jewish people, the time seems very dark indeed. Added to that were the events that were going on in the first century of the Common Era. Wars, insurrections, suffering, calamities, natural disasters, all these were part of life and often involved tremendous change. And in thinking about it, in terms of Jesus' prophecy about a coming darkness where the light seems to be extinguished, I think Jesus is reminding us how darkness and light coexist. It's rarely one or the other, but both together, bound together inextricably. So the darkness, the despair, the terror can also be seen in the context of light and hope and our faith. We're experiencing that right now in the natural world. It's not my favorite time of the year in terms of how daylight is metered out. Feels like it's getting dark at around 1:30 in the afternoon these days. So we're surrounded by a reminder of the change in the Northern Hemisphere at this time of the year, from light to darkness. And as a people of faith and in our tradition as Christians and Episcopalians, darkness is part of our understanding of the world. And in fact, it's not always a terrible thing. We base the beginning of our church year at the darkest time of the year. In a few weeks, we'll start the new church calendar year with the first Sunday of Advent. And it will be at the darkest time, the longest night of the year. I once heard a wonderful talk by a professor at seminary who said, Christians are basically people of darkness and light. We have two major feasts that we observe and celebrate, Christmas and Easter. And Christmas is an observance of darkness. It's a story about night, about the coming of Christ, the birth of Christ in the night. Whereas Easter is all about morning and radiant sunshine. And that darkness and light is part of the juxtaposition of our faith. Not one or the other, but coexisting together. Now, I have to say that understanding a narrative is sometimes a little tricky for us, because guess what? We all know the end of the story. So we tend to gloss over what it must be like to dwell in darkness, to dwell in a place where it's not clear where hope is, and to ask ourselves, where do we base our faith and what's our grounding? St. Peter's should understand that more than any other group of people because of our history. Just a reminder that on Easter Sunday in 1880, our church burned down in the middle of services. Take a minute to think about that. That as you gather to proclaim the resurrection, you watch your beloved church be destroyed. It's in our DNA, I think, as a community to understand that in that moment of darkness, it is still Easter. I wonder what the people thought that day who had attended services. I wonder if they thought that they could rebuild, if they could make again a beautiful church. Well, we know the end of the story. Of course, they succeeded, and we went from strength to strength, bringing us here today. But at the time, it must have seemed very dark indeed. But Jesus encourages us that the grounding of our faith is in the presence of God with us and the promise to be with us always, and that we must endure in that confidence and in that faith that God is always with us. So we experience darkness and light often together simultaneously, and they're not mutually exclusive. But there's also another way to think about darkness, and that is people live in darkness all around us, in terms of their struggles, their fears, their anxieties, the way their lives are lived out. And part of what we do is not simply to meditate on darkness and light, but to alleviate people who live in darkness and give them hope. To reach out to people in the world around us, to lighten their darkness. To be witnesses to the light. And that's an important part of our life of faith. It's not just an interior examination and understanding. It's not just a philosophy, but it's a call to do and to act, and to be the force of light in the world. Where there is darkness, to try our best to make it brighter. So as we come to this dark time of the year, and we very quickly, much more quickly than any of us would like, will be celebrating Christmas any minute. Think about that divine message. In the darkness, in the disenfranchised, in the wandering, there's the message of hope, the message of light. And that's given to us in the birth of Christ. Amen.